So it's wonderful to be able to welcome you to South Africa, Laura, albeit not in person this time. And it's Friday afternoon here, and I know that it's 10 o'clock in London, Ontario, where you are. And it's also different times for people across the world that are joining us today, but a very, very warm welcome to you. So we often like to start conversations, I know, with sharing a little bit about who you are and your story, but I realize that maybe that's not particularly in true narrative form. So perhaps I could ask you to share something about yourself that you'd like us to know today, just as a way of starting.
That's really hard. Yeah, what would you be interested in about me? You know, and maybe the most interesting things are that I have a dog called Biscuit, who's about 12 years old and is a little bit overweight and has sore hips. And so I relate to him more and more these days in our aches and pains. But I guess I teach at King's University College at the University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario, in the School of Social Work. But I tend to think of myself as very interdisciplinary. So, you know, I started off in psychology, then I did my social work degree, and then I took training from Michael White when I was a social worker in the Toronto area. So started to infuse narrative practices into my work way back then. Then I decided I would do my PhD. I did it in critical pedagogy and cultural studies because I was really interested. I was working a lot with women who'd experienced intimate partner violence, and they told me they would read romance novels to try and figure out how to behave so they wouldn't get beaten. And I got worried about that, and it wasn't being addressed in social work education. So I was interested in the power of discourse and how to help people deconstruct those discourses that were so problematic for them. So I did a PhD in education and then started teaching in the School of Social Work here, but carried on with a small practice on the side, not really private practice because it's with agencies and it's subsidized and all that kind of stuff. And more, and it may just have been partly my own age and my own development as I became more and more interested in spirituality, but also became more attuned to listening to people consulting with me talk about their soul and wanting to feed their soul and spiritual issues. I decided that I wanted to take another degree, and I took an MA in Christian spirituality. So my writing has shifted more and more over the years, where it's been sort of about narrative therapy and narrative practice. And then I got interested to sort of talk about Celtic spirituality. I think you know about my interest in that. And then this further study. So currently I'm writing a book called The Language of the Soul in Narrative Therapy, Spirituality in Clinical Theory and Practice. And so that manuscript's due the end of this year to Routledge, and I'm hoping it'll be out next year. So when you've asked me all my questions that you have of me, I'd love to perhaps just tell you a little bit about that book right at the end so I can get your insights as to whether you think that would be of any interest.
Absolutely. Thank you. Nsamu.
Yeah, I like your journey already from one discipline to another and the intersection of disciplines. And I can see how that is an issue in most spaces, including here in South Africa, that knowledge rather than knowledge systems and practices being siloed, and each one owning their own discipline, coming together, we actually begin to see how they intersect and relate. And I'm curious about your own intersections. How would you describe your intersections in your life story and the intersections in your life story and narrative practices and ideas?
Well, from an intersectionality lens, I would have to say that I'm, you know, a cisgendered white woman, fairly privileged. I struggled with family dynamics and poverty as a child, so I probably am not as privileged as it sometimes seems, but certainly recognize my privilege. So that's the other thing that I think what I appreciate about narrative practices is trying to be truly transparent about the position from which I'm coming and trying to equal the playing fields with people that I'm in conversation with. That's been interesting, you know, in the School of Social Work here. We have had I've been here, I'm going to my 17th year now of teaching here. And the first many years, it was predominantly young white women coming into social work and the sort of counseling field, sort of drawing just from the demographic of Southwestern Ontario, you know, farming people and first generation, that kind of thing. And London has become a site where new immigrants and refugees come, and we're becoming more multicultural. And so some of our student demographics are also changing. So it's become more and more important to use critical race theory, and to always bring that as one of the elements that needs to be considered. So the Black Lives Matter movement, obviously in the States, couldn't help but affect us in Canada, and I think the whole world, right? So those are issues that we're trying to address very carefully also. And the Indigenous, the Truth and Reconciliation document with certain 94 calls for change, and one of them was to assist in locating the bodies that were buried in unmarked graves in former residential school areas. And you know, that was maybe 5 years ago that they asked to do that, and it's been a very slow process. So they just recently found 2. So I don't know if that answers your question, but begins to.
Yeah, it does. I'm really curious because you mentioned that the book that you're working on now is Spirituality in Clinical Theory and Practice.
Mm-hmm.
As a clinician myself, I'm curious about how you see that in the context of therapy, as you're working on this book.
Yeah.
Because there's a slow outside of pastoral counseling, for example, in other fields and traditions of therapy, apart from maybe pastoral counseling and maybe in the Jungian tradition, other therapies don't get into spirituality at all.
Yes, and I think that's a real sadness, and I think came from, you know, the Enlightenment and over time a fear of religion and a fear of proselytizing. I think, you know, as I've described in the chapter in the Narrative Practitioner book, I tend to think of spirituality as being not necessarily connected to religion, and so absolutely not about proselytizing, and is more about trying to have people reflect upon what gives them a sense of meaning and purpose, what gets them up in the morning, what keeps them going. It's linked to, you know, Michael White would talk a lot about the small V values that people have. So I think it's really simple and straightforward and important to ask questions about what keeps you going, what does that imply you give value to in your life. And it's all linked to the landscape of identity if you're using a reauthoring conversation map. You know, so all the pragmatic stuff is down there in the landscape of action about who did what, when, and where. But as Michael always said, we have to be less frightened of the word why. And why is that important to you? And why is that speaks to you? And help through those absent but implicit conversations to have people articulate those deeply felt values that are really inspiring them. So I will often really simply in a first session with someone, you know, regardless of what the presenting problem is, because where I work, I'm full-time at the university here, but I do one evening a week at a counseling agency where they offer subsidized counseling and stuff. Oftentimes, because there's a subsidized program there, there's a fairly decent wait list, you know, and so once somebody finally is sort of given an appointment, and because of COVID, I'm seeing them online. But one of the first questions I'll always ask is, you know, I understand you want to sort of talk about something that's been problematic, but you know, I'm curious, what's been helping you manage in the meantime? What's been helping you cope while you've been waiting? What sorts of things have you been trying? Tell me a little bit about what's going on well in your life, so that once we get to the problem, I can be hearing about that within the context of other things that are important to you. And I think all those things are spirituality. And as I said, I think that's really important. I've got another book out that's an edited book. It's called Practicing Spirituality, reflections in personal and professional contexts. So I'd written one chapter in there about hospitality. So the rule of St. Benedict and how to use the concept of hospitality in our practices with people. And then there are a range of other authors who I invited to contribute to that book, and they're all reflecting on how to bring spirituality into practice. One woman talked about social justice issues and how it links to Qigong in China. And someone else talked about from the Pacific Rim, the Pacific Rim indigenous spiritualities. Someone else talked about Buddhist and mindfulness practices. Someone else about the importance of spirituality, end-of-life care. So a whole range of different approaches. Someone else, a wonderful African-American woman I know, wrote on spirituality and teaching social work as an academic in the US. So I think, you know, if you're not proselytizing, and if it's got to do with people's values and their meanings and their purpose, there's a place for it in all of this. And I think, as I mentioned, part of cultural humility that we ask about that, because at least here, many of our immigrants and refugees and our First Nations people, spirituality is life for them. You know, it's much more important to them than it is for mainstream culture here. So it opens up the space. I think we need to be comfortable raising it. That was a long-winded answer, wasn't it?
No, I actually like it, because I'm interested in that space myself, because I like I said, I sit at that intersection between a clinical space that has all kinds of politics assigned to that, the things, ethical codes of conduct, or the things that you can process in therapy and things you cannot. And then it all comes around to definitions. And I like how you define spirituality as really coming back to the essence of how a person makes meaning of their life, and the small v values that govern their lives, that they live their lives by.
Yes, I think that over the past, I don't know, 5 years or so, I became more aware of sort of the differences and similarities, say, between spiritual direction and pastoral counseling and psychotherapy. And I think that if someone's got training in both areas, there can be that overlap. And so I went to a wonderful presentation by a Christian narrative therapist in the States, who suggested if you're working with Christian clients, you could ask them about biblical stories that were powerful to them, and you integrate that into your practice without, even if you weren't a Christian therapist, that you could do that. In particular, she was talking about trauma and how, you know, the liminal space within trauma healing, that there's a sort of this real letting go, this sort of sense of void often in the 3 stages of sort of healing from trauma. And she said you could ask a client, for instance, is there a biblical story that resonates for you that follows that same trajectory? Thinking of Good Friday, Saturday, Easter Sunday, you know, that liminal space and the waiting sometimes that's part of the healing process. So I thought, oh, that's a good idea. I'll do that with one of my clients who identifies as a sort of charismatic Christian, and she was healing from sexual abuse and trauma. And when I asked her that question, was there anything, you know, if that was a useful question, anything that sort of mirrored what was her favorite biblical story, she told me about the walls of Jericho, and that was what was most resonating for her. And I never would have imagined that, but that's what spoke to her. And this idea of feeling like she was locked up in this tower and waiting as people were going round and around the city, and eventually the horn would be blown and she'd be rescued and get out. But she felt that she was in that moment. So for people who have a faith tradition, I think you can include it if you have the expertise and the ability. But other times I think it would be important to refer on to someone. And, you know, I think sometimes I think spiritual direction is primarily about people's relationship with God. And then, you know, sometimes therapeutic things come up that you might want to refer people on to a therapist, and vice versa. And other times there are people who are trained in both and can maybe manage both.
Thank you. And within that context, I'm wondering how you manage to negotiate exploring images of God, and especially when there's stagnation around certain images of God, or to go to deconstructing images of God that are no longer serving. I'm just wondering how you work with that.
What a great question. Again, and not one I was necessarily expecting, but super. Thank you so much. I would say early on in my career, before I'd had any training in, you know, the MA in Christian spirituality, I took my first career as a social worker was in a Catholic family service agency. And I now teach the Catholic University. So my whole career, I've been in this sort of Catholic milieu, even though I wasn't brought up Catholic. I was brought up Anglican in England, but I had a Catholic priest was one of my best clinical supervisors. He was a former priest. He'd left Ireland, and he was no longer a priest, but his faith was still really important to him. He was excellent supervisor, and he was perhaps the first person who said to me when I was in my early 30s and had never even begun to think about this, that of course you can deconstruct images of God. It was like, oh, I didn't know I was allowed to do that. I just thought, you know, God was God and I shouldn't touch that, right? he sort of very gently said, no, people develop these images of how they imagine God, often based on their experience with their father, and then to sort of project that if you're the lingo of God the Father. And I thought, oh, I'm allowed to ask about that? Like, I think I remember that often when I'm training new therapists who are scared to talk about faith or religion and spirituality with their clients. I think it's similar to that first reaction I ever had, that, oh, you know, it's actually more respectful not to ask. But I think, no, it's okay. And to recognize that these discourses develop. So the woman who was really drawn to the Jericho image, she presented in the very first session with me was that, you know, her faith was really important to her. She attended this Christian church. It was actually, she'd drive quite a long way in order to get to this church. It was a particular charismatic approach. And so she talked a lot about God. And so if that's where she's comfortable, I'm going to be comfortable talking about God with her too. However, she had a very angry, judgmental image of God. And so we did gently start looking at how had those sorts of images of God developed. And it seemed to be really linked to an overly controlling, sometimes abusive mother who, you know, bipolar, and so just really controlling. And she'd got parental figure, God as parental figure, really judgmental, and she had to do some real work at kind of thinking, okay, what are some other figures in my life and some loving characters in this church who maybe might represent a loving image? Like maybe God is more loving rather than, so we were, I'm always interested in deconstructing discourses with people. It's only been more recently that I've become more comfortable doing that in relation to God. It's been, in relation to, boys will be boys and the romanticization of abuse. But of course, discourses affect everything that we're interested in.
And as I think we may have mentioned in a conversation that you and I had previously, in South Africa, a lot of narrative therapy spills over into pastoral work. And so one of the tendencies or the discourses often associated with working in church for church is to become the rescuer, to take responsibility for people, to feel the need to almost direct to fixing in some way. And so whilst we challenge those discourses and try and deconstruct them, you also speak or mention in your book how you've been spared the experience of secondary vicarious trauma. And so I'm wondering if you could tell us perhaps about how you manage that. I think that would be helpful for us to take on board. And also you speak about vicarious resilience. And so wondering what that means for you.
Okay. Before I answer those, so hold on to those questions in case you forget what they were. The other piece, Dennis Costello, who was this former priest who was a great supervisor for me, he also was the one who said to me, and I pass this on to clients too, that some of these cases we work with are just so overwhelming that sometimes all we can do, we can't fix anything. It's a matter of helping carry the cross. And so he'd always use that image. And so I try to dissuade they are helpers, they're go-getters, they want to fix everything. And that sometimes trying to hold that back and to deconstruct that discourse also, and that discourse of being the helper and being the rescuer. I think we need to do that for ourselves, and that oftentimes it's just being with and asking the kinds of questions so that they come up with their own solutions. Michael White used to say that all the time, and it was one of my favorite sayings of his, that, you ask the questions that problems dissolve rather than help problem solve. Because if someone comes to their own answer and their own idea about what to do, then it's going to be much more meaningful and they're more likely to commit to it than if you've had a bright idea and suggested it. So I tell my students, stop being so clever. You don't have, you've had this insight as to what they could do. Don't tell them. Ask them questions so that they can get to it themselves. In terms of, I remembered, so vicarious resilience, vicarious trauma, and protecting myself from that. Again, I trained with Michael White at the Dulwich Centre. Well, I went to some of his training that he did in Canada. I worked alongside him in regards to land rights issue with Indigenous community here in southwestern Ontario. And then I also did, they offered at one point a 7-month training at Dulwich where you could go for 2 blocks. And then, so I did that training with him and then did a follow-up with him in Adelaide the year after. And whenever I saw him in conferences and people would ask him about vicarious trauma, he would say, and obviously he had a lot more experience with working with very intense cases than I have had, he would say that he'd been protected from vicarious trauma because he worked narratively. And I would say that's true for myself too, because you can listen to the problem storyline and you can ask more and more questions about the problem storyline, which is sort of the trauma storyline. And that's going to be the vicarious trauma that you're going to experience. And I think traditional approaches that go to dig away at that and look at cause and effect and how you can, spend all their time there, it's like you're reinforcing it and then you're both getting stuck in it. And I don't think that's opening up space really for the other person to move into the preferred storyline. And it certainly stops you from hearing the preferences. So giving enough space to voice that pain, but still being curious about how did they survive it? What were the moments of survival and resilience? What were other things that were going on in their lives? What, you know, the fact that they are talking about it the way they are, what does that imply as important to them? So it gets to their values, which are part of the landscape of identity. And then, you know, when are moments when you have felt you lived most in line with those values, might get you to an incident on that landscape, that preferred storyline within the reauthoring conversation. So being curious by asking all those questions that help move into the preferred and alternate storyline, then you get to hear all that good stuff and all their strength and how they survived. And so that's their resilience, and you're going to therefore benefit from vicarious resilience rather than vicarious trauma. Having said all that, I've just finished a chapter, a paper that I'm going to be presenting at a conference in July on talking about nothingness, and it's about how much the mystics love the concept of nothingness, and I love the concept of nothingness too. And so I was writing about, Edith Stein wrote about John of the Cross's work, and I've also been influenced by Teresa of Avila and this notion of the sort of turning inwards and through the various layers of the inner mansions of the soul, they can get to that inner spot, which sometimes can feel like nothingness, as you sort of feel a connection to the divine that opens up into nothingness. But there's this also, but Edith Stein talks, John of the Cross talking about the stages of the dark night of the soul, that there are stages to that dark night, and first is more like twilight and it's more gentle, then there's the darkest, and then there's the morning and the sunrise. And it made me think, Jim Duval and I wrote about this three-act play in the book that we did together. And or you think about Van Gennep's work and rites of migration, this sort of leaving one identity, going through that liminal stage, and ending up at the third stage. That liminal stage is kind of like nothingness. And I was working, as I was writing this chapter and loving it, I was also working with someone who was exploring her sexuality and her preferences, and realizing she was having to let go of one sort of identity of herself, and she was going into a deep depression that felt really like a scary, empty void as she let go of this one identity. And I thought, I was like feeling this left, right, and center. So it's not like you're protected from all of this, but I always use sort of a critical reflection lens and trying to analyze, so what's going on here, then was able to make a connection to maybe this is what's going on for her, doing all kinds of reading about how do you work with people who are going through a sense of void. And again, it was back to just be with them, right? Help carry the cross, knowing that you're going to get to the end of that night period, and sort of just being there is really important. And so at that point, you've got the vicarious resilience of having gotten out the other side, right? That you've carried on moving with them. Again, a long-winded answer. I hope that was okay.
Not at all. Thank you. It's thickening some of the ideas that we are informed by as well. And so I'm wondering whether some of the nothingness, allowing ourselves to be in the nothingness, relates in any way to the idea of reflexivity. In your book, The Narrative Practitioner, you speak of the importance of reflexivity as opportunities for growth, for personal growth. So what are some of the ways that you personally find helpful in doing so? And when you teach your students, what are some of the ways you encourage them to engage with reflexivity?
What very much informed by Jan Fuchs' work, and so she's become a close friend, and we recently had a book published called Learning Critical Reflection, Reflections on Transformative Learning. And a lot of that literature these days is drawing more and more on spirituality and the need for learning and critical reflection to bring about transformation, which for many people does have that element of spirituality. So Jan Fuchs' original model of critical reflection involved 4 theoretical frameworks, and one was informed by Donald Shun, and it was sort of the education discipline, reflecting in action and reflecting on action afterwards. The second piece was reflexivity, which was more what I think many therapists think about, and just thinking about yourself and what you bring to the equation and how that's influencing you, and where your social location and intersectionality, how does that affect everything. The third one was using postmodernism and social constructionism, and trying to deconstruct discourses and unpack language and look for whether people have set up dualisms and binaries in their accounts of incidents. And the next one was critical social theory, and looking at who has access to power and how is that shared or not, and so it's social justice piece. She and I have recently added spirituality as a 5th theoretical lens to critical reflection on practice, speaking to people really reflecting on what are your deepest and most implicit values and commitments that are influencing your work. So the way critical reflection, as she has written about it, taught it, and how I now teach it to my students, is a 2-stage process. So I teach the students critical reflection of practice, these 5 theoretical models within it. They then write up what's called a critical incident, but it's just an incident from their practice. It doesn't have to be bad, not like critical theory or anything. It just sort of something that's meaningful for them. And they then unpack that in a small group, asking themselves questions and one another questions informed by these theoretical lenses to deconstruct the incident and try and learn from it in terms of what was going on there. Then the second stage is to reconstruct it, and then sort of talk about, okay, having realized that these are my deepest values, and these are perhaps some of the things I was relying on as I was flying by the seat of my pants rather than consciously being informed by theory. What does that speak to in terms of what's important to my practice? What needs to happen here? Can I develop new theory from reflecting on my practice? Are there some social justice issues here that need to be addressed? So it's a very sort of structured form of critical reflection on practice, and reflexivity is just one little piece within it. So I find if I'm really unsettled by something, I will walk myself through that in a journaling kind of way. I'll write out an incident. I'll ask myself questions through these theoretical lenses. I'll sit with it. I'll then go back to it, and I might have a small narrative consultation group that I meet with, and might ask them if we could process it further.
Mm-hmm. So almost in a sense a peer learning group. We would use the term supervision group sometimes as well, a space where we can deconstruct our practices and the incidents and what we might be learning about ourselves and our practices through that.
Yeah, and that you can really develop new theory from practice. I think it's a legitimate form of research, really, and encourage people to think of it that way, and that you could write things up, in terms of what you find from that. I'm also offered peer consultation at at the agency that I work with, but we don't have to attend, and I find it miserable, and I don't go to it because I find there's too many people with too many different approaches. It ends up just being, well, how about this and how about that? And did you do this? And did you do that? And why didn't you do that? And I just find it unpleasant. I really like a narrative consultation group, even if we draw on other theories as well, because then it is more about questions. It's more like using an outsider witnessing kind of format
Yes.
for consultation, or using the critical reflection on practice format.
You spoke about Jan Fook, and you've mentioned Michael White, who you've had the privilege of kind of learning at the feet of, one of the early founders. Who else's work do you stand on the shoulders of? Who else influences your work and your learning?
Yeah, Michael White's the main one there. I have been to some of David Epson's master classes. It's funny that, you know, obviously they developed this approach together, but sometimes you're more drawn to the style of one person than the other. And I loved, I think Michael White's conversational maps are just so helpful. And David Epson tends not to use them quite so much, but what I've really appreciated with him is the fine attention to the detail of how to craft interesting questions, you know, so that you ask a question that gets the other person really interested too, like the person who's consulting you. I tend to be a little bit negative around how much CBT has taken off, and you know, the manualization of it and the over-reliance of a manualized approach rather than sort of thinking about relationship and not being the expert in a conversation. However, I can't help but have been influenced by some cognitive work, you know, early on in my career. And I went to some training by Nsamu Kim Berg when she was really popular. So Dennis Salibi, so the strengths perspective, that would be really informed, and I think narrative is very similar to that. This question here about CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, like it's just so researched, and so there's lots of research material on it, and so all the students think they need to learn it because it's one of the evidence-based practices, and it drives me nuts a little bit, just sort of how much it's taken over. But I think there's elements of it that are really useful, so I will draw on it sometimes. As I've been reading more to write my current book, The Language of the Soul, having done my MA in Christian spirituality in England, I was very much influenced by Peter Tyler, who is a Jungian psychotherapist and also a spiritual director, and he teaches some of the mystics. So he was my thesis supervisor for my master's degree in Christian spirituality. And so he's been influential, and he's mentioned people like Thomas More and those who've written about care of the soul. So those are people who I hadn't read a lot of, but now as I've sort of been exploring, now that I'm moving in to talk about the language of the soul, how have other people talked about the language of the soul? And of course it is a lot of Jungians who have done that. So I'm sort of treading around in that, sort of enjoying some of their writing, but at the same time thinking I want to take some of those concepts and speak it through narrative speak rather than through the Jungian. Someone asked about EMDR. I decided when it was first being introduced here, I went to a research conference where it was downplayed and it was sort of suggested that it was again based on relationship, and you need a really really good relationship, therapeutic relationship in order for EMDR to work. And that's just not the route I went down, so I didn't take training in it, but I recognize that lots of people swear by it and think it's wonderful, and I have colleagues who will draw on it from time to time also. But
Laura, for those who might not know what EMDR is, I wonder if you could just say a little bit about the ideas.
Maybe the person who asked me that should. She probably knows about EMDR more than me.
Erica, that was you. Would you like to?
Yeah, I also don't know too much about it, but it is a technique that they use for, particularly with, well, mostly with trauma. And it's to do, so it's eye movement, desensitization, something like that. So while the person is talking about the trauma and that kind of thing, they're also focusing on other things, and it can pick up just in the way that they speak and how their eyes move and all of that kind of thing. So it is something that I've also heard bits and pieces about, being interested in, but just you get so many different opinions. So I was just interested to hear what the opinion was.
Yeah, I'm not overly excited by it. I think there's tapping involved. So the person, I think, actually shuts their eyes, and then as you get them into a sort of state of relaxation, there's tapping, and that's how I understand it. And I have friends who've had training in it who get in a right panic if they lose their clicker. There's some sort of clicker they use that gives the sort of pulse, and then I guess the eyes move as rapidly as this clicker or the tapping. And I think there's probably some argument made about neuroplasticity, and it's something to do with the brain being triggered to change in terms of if you're then they're moving back into memories of the trauma, but it's being affected by then how their eye movement affects the brain. But I would suggest that neuroplasticity would argue that if you're assisting someone in moving into telling preferred and alternate storylines, I mean, that's also informed by trauma-informed care and looking at the impact of trauma, but helping them move into celebrating resilience and that preferred storyline. So that's how I work with trauma. I think narrative practices work really well with trauma.
Thank you. Nsamu, do you have any other questions? Or should we ask if there are any questions in the group that people might like to put in the chat box?
I think we can take questions from the group if there are any questions. I like what you mentioned a lot earlier about the first meeting, asking the person how they have been managing up to this point, up to the time they come to see the therapist. That's quite an interesting question to ask.
Yeah. Because they have been, right? They have been surviving somehow or other, so it's good to ask.
It almost helps to inform those acts of resistance that people aren't even aware that they are part of.
Yeah.
And situating it right at the beginning, before we even begin to talk about the presenting issue, as it were.
Yeah. Another narrative colleague of mine, his name's Scott Cooper, he also lives in the southwestern Ontario. He does some training in brief narrative therapy in particular, and we did a little research project, and I videotaped, or it wouldn't be videotape, I've dated myself there, aged myself, but a digital recording of him doing a session with a teen. And it was such a beautiful introduction. And I know he does this a lot. He says, you know, perhaps you could introduce yourself to me by telling me what kinds of things you're into. You know, he says, I don't think most people don't like to be introduced by their problems. So tell me just what kinds of stuff do you enjoy? And so into was good sort of 15-year-old language. And so the boys started talking about team sports and all these other things. And I had permission to show that to my students, and they were all, well, shouldn't you get straight to the problem? But, you know, within 5 minutes, the boy is automatically raising some of the issues that he does need to address, but at least you've done it through a different avenue. I think it's just lovely. And then you're getting some of the details that you can then reference some of the problems to. And so Scott will often use a question along the lines of, so is this taking you closer to your preference or away from, or is it biting you, he'd say. Oh no, it bites me. You know, it's not actually taking me to where I want to go at all, you know.
Laura, there's just a comment in the chat box from Kevin. I wonder if there is a place for silence in our interaction with clients.
Absolutely, yes, and that's something I made a point of raising with my narrative elective course that I just recently taught this last term. I found some lovely articles about, you know, mindfulness is being used more and more in therapeutic practices, right? And integrating it into cognitive behavioral therapy to make dialectic behavior therapy with the inclusion of mindfulness. And I really enjoy mindfulness. I think of mindfulness as being sort of on a continuum towards deep contemplation. So actually earlier, I forgot to say this when Nikki, you asked about contemplation and reflection and nothingness. I was drawn by Cynthia, you probably know her name, but I've never known how to pronounce her name, Cynthia Bourgeault, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And she has written describing that sort of transition, drawing on Thomas Keating's work, you know, again, of sort of contemplative practices and how the mind races a lot, and there's all these ideas and thoughts, and mindfulness often is about noting and letting go, and to get into those inner mansions of the soul and deep contemplation, you're having to let go of intellect and language and everything, and so there is that sense of nothing. I think with critical reflection on practice, it often is in those outer layers where we're using our mind a lot more, and then maybe we can engage in creativity or spiritual practices. But yes, I would have known how to spell her name, but I've never known quite how to pronounce her last name. So those things are really important to me. And I shared some articles with my students in my narrative therapy elective about integrating silence, integrating some more contemplative and mindfulness practices. One of the hospitals in the area has got developed
Labyrinth.
Yes, a labyrinth. So all about, you know, walking the labyrinth in silence with patients with really severe psychiatric diagnoses, but then researching and interviewing them about the impact of walking the labyrinth. And so I've posed to the students that you need to find ways to think about how to integrate silence into narrative practice. I think narrative can sometimes be critiqued that it seems so cognitive and rational and it's all in the mind, but I think the theory behind it is deep, and so then you end up thinking it's too hard to do with people, but it works beautifully with children. You can use art, and it can have this just being with and silence and walking with. So great question.
And the truth is that silence is never really silent, is it? There's a lot of thinking and thought processes happening in the silence. So
yeah,
to allow that space to be as well can be really beneficial to the people that we journey with.
Yeah. And I would also say to my students, you know, if a person can answer the question really quickly, it's maybe hasn't been the best question, because you want to ask a question that really gets them to think, that does take them a few moments maybe to answer, that you can see that they're thinking, and then that gets them to, that shows that they're thinking about their situation slightly differently, or they're beginning to remember those unique outcomes that weren't part of the problem storyline, but can be storied into the new story.
Yeah. So Tamron writes, I love crafting interesting questions. It's so important in this practice. Did Michael White write a book on this, or perhaps you do, Laura? So just wondering if there's any recommendations for Tamron.
No, I haven't seen a book on it. Where I really experienced that was in a master class that David Epstein offered. You might know the narrative practitioner Peggy Sachs, who's in the United States. She often will arrange for David Epstein to go over there. And so there were a group of us just for a few days huddled together, practicing developing questions. And I just remember some of those questions. His suggestion was that we think about all the senses and ask questions that perhaps can incorporate all the senses, you know. So I remember, I won't get it right, but one woman crafted a question along the lines of, you know, if you could go back in time to that moment and sort of wrap yourself in a blanket, you know, what would that feel like? Do you remember what the smells were? What were the tastes? Those sorts of things. So asking those types of questions that engage all the senses then perhaps seem that much more creative, literary. The other thing that I'm doing recently, I was asked to consult with a local agency that offers services to people with a cancer diagnosis. And there's some med students here who were very keen on narrative medicine. And I don't know if you know about narrative medicine much, but it developed by a woman called Rita Chiron in the States, when she recognized that students went into medicine with really empathetic hearts, really caring about people, and got popped out at the end having lost all their empathy because they'd been so focused on how to treat the body, they'd lost connection to stories. So she was a medical doctor herself, but took further degrees in creative writing and literature. And so she integrates poetry and close reading of literature for med students so that they can engage with the characters in the literature to maintain their empathy. But this is morphed into creative writing for patients, and then sometimes the doctors being involved with that or students being involved with it. So they wondered about a creative writing program for cancer patients at this local agency. And I said, that's a good idea, but the trouble is narrative medicine is more for the med students than for the patients. So we involved a social worker as well, and we've drawn on the literature of both narrative medicine and narrative therapy, but engaged a group of people in creative writing by using prompts and stuff, but being informed by this notion of resilience, moving towards preferred storylines, what's helping you cope, all that kind of stuff. So that would be another way of getting them really creative and not having to rely on your own creativity and the type of questions, but using in their creativity.
And that is the gift, I think, of narrative therapy, of working narratively, is the invitation to collaborate with so many of the arts. And I'm just aware of time, and so we're going to draw the conversation to a close. I'm not sure if there's any last questions or not, but Nsamu has a fun way of doing this. And so going to hand over to Nsamu, but just from us, a warm and lots of gratitude for the time that you've given us today, and also the hope that this may be the first of many conversations that you have with us in the Southern Hemisphere. So thanks, Laura. Thank you for making time.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been a real joy, and maybe one of these days I'll actually be able to come to South Africa. I'd love to come and visit you, and feel free to share my email with everybody in case anybody has a question or any follow-up that they have.
Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you, Laura. I've got a few kind of quick fire questions, and they don't take very long. Are you ready for a few?
Okay.
So, any of the following, I mean, you can respond in whichever way that you want to respond. The first one is sweet or sour?
Sweet.
Sweet. Tea or coffee?
Coffee.
Oh. Do you run?
Do I run?
Yeah.
Is that the question? Absolutely not.
Yeah. Not. Okay, so the reason I'm asking that question is it mountains or sea?
Mountains.
Mountains. Right. And the last one is company or solo?
Solo.
Thank you.
And there you have it. Thank you everybody for being with us this afternoon, and thank you, Laura, once again for making your time available to us.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for showing up. Thank you for the
Thank
interest.
you.
Thanks.
We'll be in touch.
Wow.
Yes,
Bye.
we definitely
Bye.
will.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Thank you. Bye for now.